Thanks. Sorry for that. I'm gonna put my water.
Hi everyone. Hi, for those of you I've not met, I'm Nikki Godden-Russell from the Law School here at Newcastle, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this special session we have with Phil Crockett Thomas, which is co-hosted by the AHRC network on Utopias and Failures, as well as the Abolition, Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence Collective, which I organise along with Alison Phipps, who's here, and Tina Seeker, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. And we are joined by some colleagues online, so welcome everyone who's also joining online for this session. So Phil Crockett Thomas writes fiction and poetry and teaches sociology and criminology at the University of Stirling. Her research focuses on social harm, justice, and creative and collaborative methods. Her fiction has appeared in Granta and on BBC Radio 4. She's also the editor of Abolition Science Fiction, which is a collection of short science fiction stories written by activists and scholars involved in prison, abolition, and transformative justice in the UK. And she's also the editor, along with Thomas Abercrombie and Rosie Roberts, of The Moon Spins the Dead Prison. So I'm delighted to say that Phil is with us today to speak to fiction, failure, and the anti-carceral imagination.
Hi everyone. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the organisers of the workshop, Ruth, Matthias and Davina, for inviting me to give this paper, and also to Nikki, Ali and Tina from the Abolition Feminism Network for co-hosting it. Thanks for everyone who's stuck with us throughout this very long and no, it's not been a very long, it's been a very stimulating day, so it feels long. And everyone who's online in the audience too. So I'm both really delighted and a bit overwhelmed to be talking with an audience like yourselves, which is full of people who've been thinking very deeply about the issues I'm going to discuss. I also just want to note that, oops, that's not working. Okay. Okay. Remove this mouse over here. Oh my God. No. Okay. Must be away. Oh God. Next. Okay. Feels like there should be an easier way to do that. Okay, yeah, so I just want to note that the backdrops to all my slides are details from Alma Thomas's beautiful paintings, inspired by space exploration from the early 1970s. Okay. Oh, next. You just tell me. Oh, okay. Thank you. Next. So in a 1982 lecture, familiar to many of you, Ursula Le Guin riffs on the ambiguity of the concept of utopia as a good place and or no place, commenting, "Utopia is uninhabitable. As soon as we reach it, it ceases to be utopia. As evidence of this sad but ineluctable fact, may I point out that we, in this room, here and now, are inhabiting utopia." Le Guin gave this lecture not in Newcastle, but in California, once seen by colonists as a promised land. But as the song goes, paradise was paved, and she critiques the Californian utopian imagination of the early 1980s as being shackled to growth, expansion, and accumulation. Le Guin approvingly quotes the novelist Milan Kundera, who commented that the building of utopias tends to necessitate a little gulag on the side of Eden for all who don't fit within the utopian vision. Excellent, thank you. So decades later, the geographer and abolitionist activist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag focused on California's intensive prison building program that began around the time of Le Guin's lecture, swelling the state prisoner population by nearly 500% in the space of 20 years. Kundera continues, "In the course of time, this gulag grows ever bigger and more perfect, while the adjoining paradise gets smaller and poorer." So since 2000, the world prison population has grown by 27%. And although prison population rates vary between different regions, globally over 10.99 million people are held in penal institutions. Worldwide, and particularly in the US, prison sentences are getting longer, and people are serving more of their sentence inside prison. And in her more recent work, Gilmore has written about imprisonment as extractive, not only of prisoners' free or cheap labor, which is like a really central focus of prior abolitionist critiques, but also of their lifetime. So she argues that prisons are places of enforced inactivity, which nevertheless allow for the circulation of capital as the system cycles people through it. So as a form of racialized organized abandonment, that's her term, imprisonment and its after effects result in vulnerability to premature death for its population, which disproportionately comprises of ethnic minorities and poor or socially marginalized people. So as Gilmore makes clear, this extraction of time not only affects the individual, but changes lives everywhere: partners, children, communities, movements, and the possibility of freedom. So the global movement for prison abolition encompasses a diversity of issues, positions, and approaches, but broadly, it seeks to abolish or significantly reduce the use of prisons and other punitive social practices and replace them with responses to social harm that center on responsibility and healing rather than on punishment and exclusion. Like many political projects seeking radical social change, the movement for prison abolition operates with a sense of temporality that oscillates between the present, the near future, and the distant future. And this complex notion of time affects abolitionist practices, strategies, and imaginaries. And I'm going to speak about the latter primarily today. So to ground this discussion in an empirical example, I'm going to discuss the theoretical framework and methodological approach of prison break. Oh, sorry, next one. Thank you. Oh, it's working now. Is it working? Mm-hmm. Ruth, please relax. Thank you. So Prison Break was an interdisciplinary research project which used creative writing workshops to support activists and scholars involved in prison abolition and transformative justice in the UK to write short works of science fiction imagining more just futures. And these were published in this book called Abolition Science Fiction, which was it's an open access book. You can download it from the website. And this book also contains discussion chapters on different themes which draw on the project participants' collective analysis of the stories that we made, relating them to current debates and learning in the movement for abolition. And the book is really designed as a resource to support readers hoping to undertake their own creative explorations of justice issues. So it includes discussion prompts, creative writing exercises, and suggestions for how you might want to, run a similar workshop yourself. And I'm really thrilled to have seen it being used in this way all over the world and now translated into Brazilian Portuguese, which is really cool. And then when I've talked about the sort of setup, I'm going to discuss some of the project's findings by sharing some of the stories or extracts from the stories in the book, drawing both on our collective analysis within the workshops and then my own sort of close reading. And I really love all the participants' writing. I mean, most of the people who took part in the project hadn't really written fiction before. And I'd love to share all of it, but I don't have time. So I've just chosen some pieces that I think speak really concretely to this conference's themes. And just as a heads up that one of these stories is about sexual violence, but I'll give you a warning again before I share it. Okay. So in recent years, the concept of abolition has traveled somewhat. It's been mobilized in order to consider other practices and institutions that we might want to radically transform or abolish. And I think this receptiveness to radical proposals speaks to our contemporary moment. A time of uncertainty and anxiety about the present and future of the planet. And I think such instability creates an opportunity and also urgency for rethinking and reworking other forms of social arrangements, not only those that are obviously kind of problematic, like borders, but also idealized or cherished institutions like the family, as in Sophie Lewis's work on the left. And this mirrors a characteristic of the contemporary anti-carceral imagination, which is to think about justice outside the silo of criminal justice. So, for example, you have Fred Moten and Stefano Hani asking, what is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. We'll come back to this at the end. So this sensibility is reflected in the collective maps that we created as part of our workshop was one of our workshop exercises, which worked on kind of depicting what a world without prisons and punishment could be like. And I think what's really striking about these maps is their sense of entangled social justice. So they've got suggestions for how education, food provision, housing, etc. could and should be different. So criminal justice is just one aspect of the sort of anti-carceral imagination of a just society. And this backs up, the point that abolitionists continually stress, which is that their aim is not to remove prisons from society without also attending to other carceral institutions and practices. So a really crucial aspect of this is how we imagine and enact anti-carceral ways of living and organizing ourselves in the present against the dominant carceral logic. So as Angela Davis notes, the prison is considered so natural that it is extremely hard to imagine life without it. In Deleuzean terms, the prison has sort of territorialized our imagination of responses to social harm and justice. And the Prison Break project grew from an observation that I kept kind of coming across in the work of activist scholars and activists around really that the importance and energy needed to document and to critique the harms of prison and other forms of punishment can really limit our capacity for developing alternative visions and practices of justice that could be truly transformative. It's really hard to do that kind of crucial speculative work when there's so much firefighting to do and when burnout is endemic. So in a very limited way, my project aimed to make a space for this kind of imaginative work through a process of ontological research creation. So a form of practice whose analytical framework does not study what already exists, but acts by bringing something new into the world. And kind of thinking with this idea, I've been drawing on the work of scholars like Sarah Truman. So a key objective of the project was thus to explore through this process of research creation that produced this book, how nurturing the expression of my participants' anti-carceral imagination might both deepen our understanding of what Rhea Benjamin calls the carceral imaginary and help us think beyond containment and exclusion as the primary social responses to harm. So while I teach within the social sciences, my first education was in the arts and humanities, and I've got an ongoing creative practice that you kindly alluded to, which I incorporate into my research and teaching. And in getting away with this, I'm really indebted to feminist scholars who have embraced the affordances of speculative fiction for experimenting on the thresholds of knowledge production, for example, through troubling fact, through speculative fabulation like Donna Haraway, or to materialize and politicize archival absences via critical fabulation. That's like the words of Saidiya Hartman. So in this project, I've focused on fiction as a verb, so fictioning. So the way that the writing of fiction, particularly in collaboration with others, can open up a space to imagine the world anew, and in doing so, transform our practice in the present. And in order to conceptualize collaborative fictioning, I've drawn the work of the art scholars David Burrows and Simon O'Sullivan, who, inspired by Deleuze and particularly his notion of fabulation, also inspired by Bergson, described one of the functions of fictioning to be mythopoiesis. I'm terrible at pronouncing words. And they frame this as a kind of address to the future that might help generate a people to come or help build new worlds. So as such, Prison Break also sought to investigate the role that fictioning can play in the sort of dialectical move between imagination and praxis, articulated by Ernst Bloch and more recently Ruth Levitas. So my project is underpinned by a conceptualization of the imagination as something that's situated, social and speculative. And I think this conceptualization is quite widely shared within the social sciences by social justice activists and scholars, and also among the scholars and writers of science fiction. So for example, in the social sciences, we have Seabright Mills's egalitarian notion of the sociological imagination that's involved in making connections between private and public troubles, making them legible. We have Robin D.G. Kelly's history of the Black radical imagination, which demonstrates how, and I quote, revolutionary dreams erupt out of political engagement and how collective social movements are incubators of new knowledge. And I think the social imagination is also at work in science fiction. As well, it entails the imaginative construction of new or alternative words, different in some way from our own. The narrative invites us to, consider its relation to the world as we know it, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. So as such, many writers of science fiction have argued that the genre can tell us more about the present than the future. So for example, working with Darko Suvin's influential concept of science fiction as a literary genre defined by cognitive estrangement, Samuel Delany writes that science fiction's relation to the present is one of dialogic, contestatory, agonistic creativity. In science fiction, the future is only a writerly convention that allows the SF writer to indulge in a significant distortion of the present that sets up a rich and complex dialogue with the reader's here and now. So, I don't have time to go into this today, but I just want to note that social scientists have been explicitly drawing on science fiction as a resource for social estrangement since at least the 1950s. So I'm certainly not the first person to be exploring this ground, For example, this is a picture of an amazing collection from 1967 that I found in a Glasgow charity shop one day. It felt like a good omen. So my project is also really deeply indebted to and inspired by contemporary activist approaches that have cultivated a space for reading, especially speculative fiction, and for creative writing practices. And these activists embrace fiction as a resource for reflecting on the past and for hope for the future, and as a tool that can help work through issues in ways that are different from non-fiction. So as Kelly argues, the most radical art is not protest art, but works that take us to another place, envision a different way of seeing, perhaps a different way of feeling. And the most well-known publication resulting from this work is the speculative fiction anthology Octavia's Brood, which is pictured on the screen, named in honor of the Black feminist writer Octavia E. Butler, created by social justice activists and community organizers in the US. The book's editors, Adrienne Marie Brown and Willida Emerisha, describe their activism as a form of science fiction because of the way it entails moving beyond the boundaries of what seems realistic or possible. So Emerisha termed the work in the anthology visionary fiction, noting that this term reminds us to be utterly unrealistic in our organizing, because it is only through imagining the so-called impossible that we can begin to concretely build it, end quote. As Brown describes, collaborative fictioning acted as a safe exploring ground to tackle difficult issues without serious worldly consequences. However, and this is really important, they both emphasize that it's not a choice between imagination and practice, but a dialectical process where both aspects are indispensable. So despite this sort of embrace of speculative fiction in the movement, and you can, I think, see this in the inclusion of works of fiction in many of the kind of more recent books on the topic that have been kind of coming out, there is also ambivalence expressed about the concept of utopia within the movement for prison abolition. So, for example, in Abolition, Feminism Now, Angela Davis and her co-authors write, "Abolition is by necessity speculative, and we ardently embrace its utopian dimension. Yet, if a movement is framed as a progression towards utopia, its conceptual and organizing moves can also reinforce a central myth about abolition, that it is impractical, unattainable, a dream. Utopian approaches can be cast as limited, and it's the refrain too often leveled against abolitionists, along with our evangelical zeal, our naivety, our failure to be pragmatic, and our extremism." So while agreeing in one sense that the utopian is energizing and to be embraced, the authors are concerned that the project of abolition will be contaminated by a sort of popular prejudice against utopia, which will then dissuade people from joining the cause. Activist scholars also ruminate on the harm that utopia can do within movements of social justice. For example, Molly AHRC identifies the distress that can be experienced by activists believing that they can end violence and harm and realize a utopia free of these things. Perhaps utopia can sometimes act as an attachment that can wound, as in Lauren Ballant's conception of cruel optimism. However, as Tom Myland argues, the idea of utopia as blueprint has long been delegitimized by its implication in authoritarian regimes and genocides, and was then kind of recast in its subversive form in the late 1960s in the work of writers like Le Guin and Delaney, who were buoyed by the time's social movements for racial, sexual, and gender equality. So such writers and their readers rejected, in Moylan's words, utopia as a blueprint while preserving it as a dream, creating these sort of critical utopias, again, an idea that I'll come back to, that perform their own contradictions. So drawing on the work of scholars such as Davina Cooper and Ruth Levitas, within the project, we've worked from the start with the idea of utopia as a sort of process consisting of fragments, experiments, and failures rather than as a fixed program. So as this project sought to learn from the expertise of people who were involved with activism and scholarship on prison abolition and restorative justice, I approached individuals and activist groups directly, inviting them to then recommend others from their networks who might be interested in taking part. And I think a really crucial part of this was people who had some involvement in activism, but at the same time wanted to do a creative writing project. So yeah. And then I designed and facilitated 3 two-part creative writing workshops, holding 2 online and 1 in person, so just kind of coming out of the pandemic, working with 28 activists and scholars based in England, Wales, and Scotland. And each pair of workshops lasts for around 4 hours and comprised of a mix of reading and discussion based on this resource that I created, which contains of quotes and extracts based on themes of abolition and utopia. and then also creative writing exercises, which were designed to develop different skills and explore project themes. I then worked with some of the participants individually to polish and finish their stories. And then finally, we met as a whole group for a sharing symposium where we discussed and celebrated the 14 stories, manifesto, and poem that were finished and included in the publication. So I included everything that was finished. But yeah, okay. So creative writing workshops invite writer participants to explore and express their experience in new ways. And as such, this kind of approach has ethical affordances for working with people who have stigmatized knowledge. So for example, in supporting the telling of different stories from those that are privileged or demanded by the state, for example, for aid or asylum, or in creating composite characters to act as proxies for different experiences, thus minimizing the pressure to share traumatic personal stories in an exposing way. And collaborative fictioning has meant reading, writing, and thinking with others. As in all work, all research, there was a real power imbalance between myself as a researcher and the project's participants, and I don't want to minimize that. There were also interesting differences in the group, which was self-selecting, as I said. So, for example, in those differences in terms of people's social or professional status, there was differences in terms of people's experience as a writer or activists, their experiences of either criminalization or violence, and also, importantly, how networked or connected they were to other members of the group. So a more equitable balance of power was aided by happy accidents, such as none of the participants occupied a kind of top slot in all of those things, and we all had sort of differential status, I guess, and by strategies like budgeting to pay everyone for their time equally. And just to say, feminist critiques of social science methods being underpinned by exploitative and extractive logics are well-founded. And in this project, fiction sort of functioned as a mechanism whereby participants could control what they shared with the project and what they wanted to reveal. So I didn't gather up people's work. People gave me things, and I didn't ask for things they weren't willing to give. So Moylan's concept of the critical utopia also influenced the project's methodological approach. So at the end of each part of the workshops, I ran a longer writing exercise, which I adapted from Michael Dearwater, who's a science fiction scholar and writer based in Glasgow. And this exercise involved participants individually coming up with a novum. So in this case, an innovation or a difference that meant prisons or punishment no longer existed, or that would kind of significantly change the way we responded to social harm and conflicts. And participants came up with nova such as prisoners become able to walk through walls, bodies can be physically contained, but consciousness can be downloaded into a free body, or prisons are replaced by a form of ritual mediation in a healing forest. So participants then wrote scenes set in this future from the perspective of an alien visitor, which is a long-running narrative device within the genre that many of you will be familiar with. So the second time I ran the exercise, there was an additional challenge. So now you need to think of an unintended effect of your novum. So now participants were invited to write a scene where their protagonist, who was aware of this unintended effect, must decide what, if anything, to do about it. So this edition was partly a way to bring dynamics into the plot, but also in inviting the consideration of unintended effects or problems, it encouraged the development of critical utopias. Further, it was also a kind of a way to attempt to sort of do away with the overwhelm or the kind of paralysis of the task of solving the problem of prisons by incorporating problems and imperfections into the plot that allow us to think with the stories rather than focusing on their failure as a utopia. And in this way, this second prompt sort of introduced fault lines, as Thaler has identified in the utopian fiction of Kim Stanley Robinson. So Thaler argues that through fictional explorations of the ramifications of various projects to mitigate environmental catastrophe, Robinson's fiction depicts failure as a necessary component of learning how to inhabit a climate change world, which is intended to motivate his readers to take action in the present rather than withdraw from fear of failure. Just to also mention that another way we kind of incorporated failure fault lines into the design was through encouraging participants to really embrace cliche as a resource, both the cliche of science fiction, and also I guess the cliches within abolition. Yeah, so we can maybe talk about that later. Okay, so I'm now going to share some extracts from some of the stories created by project participants. We're talking about prison abolition, so let's start with Dystopia. In PR2 by Sarah Armstrong, the central character is the prison record system currently used by the Scottish Prison Service. That's all I'll tell you. I'm just going to play you a short extract that was recorded for the audiobook, which is read by the author. Oh my God. No. Not sure what's happening now because that was working perfectly before. Okay. Oh, I really wanted you to hear someone else's voice. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay, sorry, you have to do with me instead.
Sorry,
Oh.
no, not with me.
This one. Okay. PR2 grows as it flows through halls, front desks, back offices, classrooms, and conference PowerPoints. People sucked up, chewed up, and spat out as their parts. Human meal poured into the hungry, gaping mouths. The risk prediction machine, the parole hearing, the research study, the annual report, the ICMs and RMTs and mappers. As people wait and wait, PR2 steals their highs and lows, their sense and their nonsense. It names them in the spirit of misflights birds, suicide attempt, age, weight, and height, bereavement, methadone prescription, offender behavior, course completion, conviction history, liberation date, canteen order, pro-social factors, fighting report. Bumpy backgrounds binarized to invent infinitudes of the same story. Risk up, down, remand pop up, down, suicide history, yes or no. Chaotic lives and bad childhoods in, recidivism risk out. PR2 is a black box around a black hole, a nothingness that grows from its insatiable appetite for stars. Okay.
See if I've changed this.
Don't worry about it. Thank you. Okay, so the story is not set in the future, but uses the science fiction trope of the agentic machine or bad computer to articulate the present harms of the kind of quantification, surveillance, and bureaucratic violence that underpins what Feely and Simon characterized as the new penology. So the story demonstrates Armstrong's situated knowledge as an activist scholar who possesses a detailed understanding of how the legal system operates in Scotland and how it harms. Earlier in the piece, the story depicts an important aspect of the slow violence of imprisonment and other forms of detention, which is the prolonged waiting that incarcerated people and their loved ones are subjected to. For example, in Scotland, as in many other jurisdictions, some prisoners are subjected to indeterminate sentences, which might destroy hope. Might. So this is an example of what Gilmore referred to as the extraction of prisoners' lifetime. So when abolition science fiction was used by another colleague in a prison-based reading group in Scotland, PR2 was the story that members of the reading group feared would get the book confiscated. So the story was perceived as dangerous, not because it advocates like rioting or burning down the prison like some of the other stories in the collection do, but because of the insider knowledge about one of its key operating systems. So importantly, PR2 foregrounds the presence of dystopia within the anti-carceral imagination, not as a distinct sort of distant threat or a fantasy, but as an existing reality, one that largely, socially we choose to ignore. Okay, I'm really sorry you're stuck with me reading stuff. If you want to listen to people read their stories, there's an audiobook as well, so you can listen to them. So I'm going to read you an extract from The Monument by Dave. In the centre of the city stands a monument, a maze of sheets of blue metal winding around a network of fountains. And engraved into the sheets in silver lettering, the names and ranks of every active police officer still employed on the day the new acts came into effect, the day of abolition. The monument is accompanied by a special plaque which contains a note of gushing praise for these officers and the service that they have rendered to their community. This lavish recognition, like the generous severance packages and comprehensive retraining schemes negotiated by the Police Federation in the final months of its existence, before it was forced to transform into a retiree social club, is by way of a compromise. It indicates very clearly that no personal condemnation of the police or of those who took their side was implied by the success of the abolitionists. The campaign against them had been nothing personal, only ever a form of constructive critique, a set of modest proposals for how society could be better governed and how resources could be better allocated. Abolition was a success of evidence-based policy over tradition and inertia. During the lengthy planning and consultation stages, the message was sternly affirmed that the monument was not a celebration of the victory of the abolitionists. The word abolition appeared nowhere in official documentation, being referred to variously as the cessation of outmoded practices, the redistribution of limited resources, and most commonly simply, the reforms. The names of those killed in the riots or tortured in police stations are not included in the monument. It was only by avowing that the officers had faithfully discharged the duties demanded of them by society, up until the point that these duties were no longer required, that the political settlement could be maintained. So the monument by Dave is unusual amongst the stories, and that it starts with a description of how the abolition of policing came about. So as project participant Cara Jardine commented, people complain that abolitionists don't provide a roadmap to abolition, but the dystopian scenario presented by Dave seemed like a really believable way of how you might get there by having it all couched in evidence-based policy and cost saving. The plot covers the morning routine of a municipal heritage warden and former police officer on his way to patrol the monument. And the narrative point of view is a detached third-person perspective, and this, in combination with the use of policy discourses, demonstrates the piece of satirical humour. Echoing abolitionist calls to look beyond the prison to carcerality as it exists in other institutions and practices that I mentioned earlier, Dave explains, I was concerned not so much with what comes after policing as what runs alongside it. And project participant Koska Duff suggested that the story invites abolitionists to reflect in ways that might be uncomfortable, both on the limitations of strategies that opt for gradual reform and on the carceral and exclusionary practices in our other institutions and relations with others. But what of Utopia in the project stories? So to discuss this, I turn again to Le Guin's lecture, her lecture from 1982. And so drawing on Taoist philosophy, Le Guin argues that the dominant historical model of Utopia has been the sort of big yang motorcycle trip, characterized as qualitatively bright, dry, clear, strong, active, aggressive, progressive, creative, and hot, among other things. And you can see this kind of utopian impulse in several of the stories, where the catalyst for abolition comes from incarcerated people and a prison riot or overthrow, its impact then hopefully rippling out across society. And this emphasizes the importance of the agency of incarcerated people and the inspiration drawn from their resistance for the movement. And there's also a sense of pleasure and perhaps nostalgia in stories that channel the yang utopian form, combined perhaps with a little bit of embarrassment from some of the scholars, some of the authors rather, indulging in this form while being kind of serious activists and scholars. And you can see this in people not using their full names. Okay, right. The next bit I'm going to read you is by Lizzie Hughes, and it's called The Seed. Sorry, very unslick, not expecting all this. The seed in the plant pot, buried in its mud. The pot is faded yellow, average sized, thick rimmed at the top, narrowing to a circular base. The kind of thing you see and instantly forget. In fact, I had to look at it a few times to write that. It sits out of the way on top of one of the grey filing cabinets in the corner. I think the one with the risk assessments in? Somebody's idea to bring life into this place of death, probably Linda's. No one knows what kind of plant it is. No one waters it either, and yet it grows. and grows and grows. It grows, tendrils curving and arching up towards the office window with reinforced glass. Its thick ivy leaves conceal what it is up to as it grows into the walls of the office, into the bricks, into the infrastructure of the prison, causing cracks. Each day, it prizes apart the prison's molecules. It travels further into its fibers, winding deeper and deeper. It spreads across concrete yards like a lush green carpet. So in contrast to the stories that focus on a moment of revolt and liberation, The Seed by Lizzie Hughes offers a different abolitionist temporality. So presenting an image of passive yet constant resistance, the protagonist plant sat on a filing cabinet uses the infrastructure of the prison against it. And this is a different kind of revenge fantasy and reminiscent again perhaps of Le Guin's proposition for a yin utopia, countering the dominant yang, which would be, among other things, dark, wet, obscure, passive, participatory, circular, peaceful, nutrient, and cold. After the plant finishes its work, the former captives emerge into landscapes that are too big, too bright, too loud, with too many things in them. Liberation from the prison is presented as a transition that takes time and for some may never be complete. And one could also think about the growing seed as an image of the temporality of activist struggle, seen from a collective or historical viewpoint. So as the activist scholar Marianne Kabar notes, as an activist, your individual timeline is not the timeline on which movements occur. When you understand that you're really insignificant in the grand scheme of things, then it's freedom to actually be able to do the work that's necessary as you see it and contribute to it in the ways you see fit. So I think this story could be seen as an attempt to sort of decenter the individual and think present and activist temporalities together. I know I'm running out of time. I want to offer two examples of stories from the project that engage with the idea of the critical utopia. So the first is Moments by Anonymous, which is on the theme of sexual violence. But I keep clear of descriptions. Okay. I blink. I force myself to see that between us lies another body, frozen and flickering too. I know that this body is also hurt and needs to be held. Not by me. No, that will never happen. I never want to hold you, but by someone else, perhaps. I heard at a party there have been a few since me. I know that these bodies are both in pain, that you inflicted yours on me doesn't matter now, I guess. I need to heal, you need to heal. We both have to stop hurting. And yet, I am filled with rage. I heard at a party you have done this to more since me. I know I still want to blow your brains out. I have to be honest about this, so I do it again. You obliterate. I do not think I am satisfied. I don't feel any better. I just feel guilty. As your simulated form resembles once more, I look down. My weapon has evaporated. Instead, my hands are cupped and filled with tiny seeds. I remember that I know I have worked hard to nurture these seeds within me, tiny possibilities of healing that still need time to grow. Perhaps it will take the rest of my life. Some of these will die, others will survive, one or two might thrive. And I know that pain like this will only cause them to shrivel and hollow, like spat out pips drained of their goodness. So, using the familiar sci-fi narrative structuring device of time loops, this story offers a powerful analysis, I think, of the temporality of harm and justice as non-linear, and of a critical utopia. So the protagonist uses a virtual reality simulation rather than live time to repeatedly confront and murder the person who has sexually assaulted them. So narratives involving time loops have become popular enough to move outside of the sci-fi genre, and Schneiderman suggests that their appeal is that reliving the past holds the wholesome therapeutic promise of correction and improvement. However, unlike Groundhog Day, where the protagonist is compelled to repeat time, but through repetition, the past and future are both changed for the better, for the protagonist of Moments, no matter how many times they choose to return to the scene, the past cannot be erased and will always figure in their future, although it might be changed. So the scene of the simulation is set up as a conversation between the protagonist and the person who harmed them, but the protagonist has removed their attacker's ability to speak. So inspired by the anonymous author's personal experiences, Moments is rooted in a dialogue between a desire for revenge and abolitionist principles, facilitated by the exploring ground of fictioning. In response to the story, participant Jess Poyner commented, "You can live in the middle. It's not a binary." And I think that the story really encapsulates that and the difficulties we all have around that. So as Kabar notes, in all her years of organising, she has never known an abolitionist who thought that nothing was the preferred alternative to imprisonment. We believe in consequences for harm. And building on approaches developed by racialised and other marginalised groups unwilling or unable to seek help from state agents in resolving harm and conflict, transformative justice practices were developed to address sexual violence within communities and activist movements, often by survivors of this violence who felt failed or harmed by formal justice systems. And rather than idealizing such processes, the story, really echoes the accounts of transformative justice practitioners of how challenging and time-intensive dialogue-based approaches to justice can be for everyone who's involved. The protagonist wants to face their attacker, but only as a simulation that they can control, and not to forgive them, but as part of their own healing process. And the piece ends with the line, "This is my utopia, I will be free." And I think, as the rhyme protagonist really makes clear, this is a sort of solitary utopia of compromise. So without real-world accountability, there is hope for a kind of peace, perhaps here, but not justice. And as such, this utopian scheme contains a failing or a fault line, which invites the reader to take action in the present. Am I completely out of time? No? Okay. All right. Oops, sorry. Okay. I'll just read you a little bit of Day 62 on Earth by Jess Poyner. The colony was full of celebration, for today was one of its children's self-naming days. My host introduced me to the child as Carlos a week ago, and I'd first been invited into their core family home. At a certain age, generally around the age of 12, a child can choose a naming day where they may present their past, present, and future selves to their community. For some children, this happens once in their life. For most, this time of inward reflection and contemplation of self and relationship to their community is rehashed continuously and celebrated once every 5 years or so after the first self-naming day. So Day 62 on Earth is set on a future planet Earth within a colony of the descendants of survivors from both sides of the eugenics wars, which sound terrifying. The narrative is told from the perspective of an honoured alien visitor and resembles sort of field notes or a report. And as Suvan notes, the sort of education novel plot structure is really common within sci-fi, where a sort of naive or outsider comes to understand the novum for themselves and therefore, allows us to understand it too. In this case, the visitor learns how the colony handles social harm and conflict without the use of punishment and prisons, in contrast to their own society, which is carceral. And the novum is that the colony is founded on the principle that life is sacred, life is interdependent, and life is growth. And this knowledge, gained from catastrophic loss, has led them to develop ongoing rituals where the community gathers to offer praise and suggestions for growth, kind of constructive criticism to each other. So this society could in some ways be seen to kind of embody elements of Le Guin's characterization of a yin utopia that I mentioned before, particularly a sort of participatory, cyclical, peaceful, and nutrient. For example, in response to the second prompt that was aimed at generating critical utopias, Day 62 on Earth introduces a character who does things that cause harm in the society that one of the other project participants called Chris Rossdale dubbed the inconvenient person, which we all loved. And Poyner shared that the story was partially inspired by the complexities of real intentional community building and the experience of those who don't fit within radically inclusive groups. So instead of excluding the characters, the others engage in a process of dialogue and accountability, and the story really reflects that kind of abolitionist argument that no one is disposable. And this attitude is really literalized in the story because there's so few people left that they can't be sort of wasted through imprisonment. And Rossdale comments, that account of a society that has got rid of prisons and is doing justice differently, we expect to be written about in quite affirming and extolatory ways. But in that moment, abolition is experienced as tragedy. Carcerality is a luxury that society can't afford. So the colony aims to show the alien visitor the superiority of their approach to justice. So although the story fits with some of the characteristics of a sort of yin utopia as described by Le Guin, it's also yang in its creativity, clarity, and action. Le Guin is clear, of course, that the problem of utopia will not be saved by the yin utopia replacing the yang. She contends that, it's as hard to reach utopia by going backwards, which is how she characterizes yin, as it is to keep going forwards. And instead, she kind of proposes forging a path roundabout or sideways that balances the two. So I would say that it's not a sort of binary either or utopia that she seeks, but an and utopia. Should I just end it there? I should end it there. I'm just going to end it there.